A man watches the first nuclear explosion in human history successfully go off, transforming the world with the beginning of the atomic age. A few words come to mind from the ancient Hindu text known as the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. It would have been impossible without him, the father of the atomic bomb, J. Robert Oppenheimer. But who was he? Was he a merchant of death, the designer of the deadliest weapon of all time? Or was he a principled scientist who hoped to prevent future wars? Was he a dedicated American patriot who wanted to make sure his homeland got the weapon that could finish the Axis powers? Or was he a secret ally of the United States' next great enemy? The answer isn't clear, and to find the truth we have to go back to the beginning. Julius Robert Oppenheimer's story begins in New York City on April 22, 1904. He was born into a non-observant Jewish family. His mother worked as a painter while his father was an impressive man in his own right, a wealthy textile importer who had immigrated to America from Prussia in 1888. The family would soon be joined by J. Robert's younger brother Frank, and they would move to an impressive apartment on the Upper West Side. Between Ella Oppenheimer's love for art and Julius's wealth, it was no surprise that the apartment was soon covered with some of the most famous works of art in the world, including paintings by Picasso and Van Gogh. But the family would ultimately be known for science, not art. As J. Robert and Frank began their elementary studies, they were sent to a prep school, but not just any prep school. In 1911, J. Robert entered the Ethical Culture Society School, an experimental school founded by social reformer Felix Adler. Its goal was not just to raise smart children, but smart children grounded in ethics who would go on to do great things. It was part of a large secular humanist movement that was gaining momentum in education by the early 20th century, and it would heavily influence the lives of the Oppenheimer sons. But while J. Robert would learn much about ethics in school, his interests lay in academics. He would breeze through his studies, gaining a particular interest in mineralogy and, of course, chemistry. He even skipped several grades, and by the time he was 18, he was ready to take his next step. Because Oppenheimer was going to Harvard. Despite being derailed by a serious illness he got while prospecting in Europe, which delayed his plans by a year, J. Robert Oppenheimer was ready for the Ivy League. However, while he was recovering, he spent time in New Mexico, where he would fall in love with the Southwest. This was a region he would come back to in the future, of course, but for now, he was happy to return to New England. While he gained a general education at Harvard, he aggressively sought advanced chemistry courses and even sought to make up for the year he was delayed by taking extra classes. He was so ambitious that he decided to switch to physics for graduate school and was admitted solely on the basis of his independent studies, skipping multiple entry-level courses. In only 3 years, he would graduate Harvard with honors. But his education was just beginning. Nearly dying in Europe didn't deter Oppenheimer from crossing the Atlantic once more as he decided to attend Christ's College in Cambridge. While he was rejected by his initial choice of laboratory mentor Ernest Rutherford, he decided simply to head to England anyway and just try to hustle his way into another internship while he was already there. He was ultimately accepted by British Nobel laureate J.J. Thomson, who found Oppenheimer's mind sharp but his lab discipline lacking. Oppenheimer was assigned a tutor to get him up to speed on lab procedures, something he loathed. It would be a common pattern in Oppenheimer's life. He was a genius, but one who didn't like to be told to do things the slow way. But he also displayed a few dark tendencies. Oppenheimer's tutor, Patrick Blackett, was a disciplined man and only a few years older than Oppenheimer. The two clashed, and at one point Oppenheimer doused an apple with noxious chemicals and left it for Blackett to eat. This nearly led to Oppenheimer being placed on academic probation, but things were smoothed over. It wasn't the only time Oppenheimer displayed strange behavior patterns. The young scientist was obsessive about his work, often neglecting his basic needs when he was obsessed with a puzzle. He smoked intensely, forgot to eat, and once reportedly strangled a friend when the friend shared the news that he was engaged. It would be the start of a life of psychological issues for Oppenheimer, but he was unconcerned by the difficulties this would cause. After all, as he once told his younger brother, "I need physics more than friends." But even this challenging environment would not prove enough for Oppenheimer's curiosity and ambition, and he would soon head to one of the world's hubs for physics, Germany. He enrolled in the University of Göttingen in 1926 to study under the legendary Max Born. Often known as the father of quantum mechanics, Born was a sought-after mentor who attracted some of the best minds in the world, including German theoretical physicist Werner Heisenberg and Italian nuclear scientist Enrico Fermi. Oppenheimer had finally found a place where he could truly be challenged, and he was enthusiastic about his studies, maybe too enthusiastic. He would take over seminars with his passionate rhetoric, and a group of students at one point threatened to boycott the class unless Born managed to quiet Oppenheimer down. But dark clouds were brewing. Oppenheimer studied in Germany at the height of the Weimar era, when Germany was becoming a post-war hub of culture, industry, art, and science, albeit one struggling with a devastated economy after the First World War. But intolerance was rising, and Oppenheimer no doubt felt it as a Jewish man. No one knows what kind of Nazi oppression he experienced during this time, but it didn't leave him inclined to stick around. He earned his doctorate at the young age of 23 in 1927, not before reportedly interrogating his test administrator. He and Born co-published a famous paper, the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, which presented a method for neglecting nuclear motion in calculations without losing much accuracy. And then it was time for him to depart. Oppenheimer had left America as an ambitious and troubled student and returned a famous physicist who was highly in demand, so in demand that there was soon a fight over exactly where he would land. The United States National Research Council wanted him to join their team at Caltech, while Harvard wanted him back working for them. Oppenheimer, not liking to be told what to do, predictably went down his own path and split his fellowship between the two universities on both coasts. While at Caltech, he would become friends with fellow physicist Linus Pauling, but a potential affair between Oppenheimer and Pauling's wife brought an end to that. The two would never work together again, not just because of personal disputes, but because Oppenheimer's future was destined to stay away from Pauling's pacifist beliefs. Fate had a different plan for Oppenheimer. He soon began to work as a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, but not before some more travels in Europe and then purchasing a ranch in New Mexico. As a professor, Oppenheimer was known to be eccentric and hard to get to know. His students were notorious for becoming extremely invested in his classes, often adopting his mannerisms and spending more time on his assignments than any other. He continued to push the boundaries of physical science, often collaborating with the government. In his personal life, he was known to be apolitical and disinterested in world affairs at first. So invested in his own studies, he reportedly didn't even learn about the Great Depression until 6 months after it began. But then, something changed. By 1934, Oppenheimer had become aware of politics and was particularly passionate about opposing the fascist tide sweeping Europe. As the Nazis took power, Oppenheimer dedicated a portion of his salary to supporting German scientists who wanted to escape Germany. He also would become involved in union affairs and raise money for various left-wing caucuses. This led to many people wondering if he was becoming another member of the U.S. Communist Party, which was growing in support among academic circles. But this accusation had little to no backing. Oppenheimer was never much for romance either, but that was about to change. Oppenheimer's turn to the left coincided with him getting involved with women who shared his views. First was Jean Tatlock, a daughter of a Berkeley literature professor and radical journalist. The two had a short but passionate relationship, and it would be less than a year later before he would meet Kitty Puning. Another young radical, she was married when she had an affair with Oppenheimer and quickly divorced her husband and took off with a physicist. Looks like J. Robert Oppenheimer embraced more than one type of chemistry during his professor years. And the new Catherine Oppenheimer would be a key influence on her husband. Catherine was much more than a political activist. Born in Prussia, she would become a renowned biologist and botanist in her own right. She was also deeply involved in several radical groups. She and Oppenheimer would have 2 children, but Oppenheimer's issues with personal relationships cropped up again. He would have affairs with Tatlock while married. This meant he was essentially cheating on one communist with another, and this frequent contact with members of the party would come back to haunt him, because he was about to undergo the most critical job interview of his life. As the Nazi Party consolidated its control over Germany and then launched World War II, Oppenheimer only became more dedicated to opposing them. But his own government wasn't exactly on his side either. The FBI opened a file on Oppenheimer in 1941, chronicling all his contact with members of the Communist Party. While they didn't find that he engaged in any criminal conduct, they did find that he was a member of multiple organizations they considered subversive, including the now mainstream American Civil Liberties Union. Oppenheimer was not targeted by law enforcement, but he was put on a list of potential targets for custodial detention in the event of a national emergency, aka if civil liberties were suspended. But the government was about to need him for a very different reason. By October 1941, the U.S. was still neutral, only supplying the Allies with the equipment they needed. But everyone knew that sooner or later the U.S. would come and join the fray. The sneak attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't on anyone's mind, but it was clear that the imperial ambitions of the Axis powers would keep growing. So not only was President Franklin Roosevelt planning for war, he was planning for the next big weapon, an atomic bomb. National Defense Research Committee Chairman James B. Conant was put in charge of the early phases, and he had previously been a lecturer at Harvard when Oppenheimer was studying there, so he knew his old student had a mind that needed to be on board with this plan if it was to succeed. And soon, the project would become vital to the U.S. war plan. When Oppenheimer was first brought on board, he was tasked with doing neutron calculations. While Oppenheimer was definitely working on the building blocks of an atomic bomb, it was all very theoretical, and he threw himself into it with his typical zeal for physics puzzles. Security wasn't nearly as tight at this point, and he even shared many of his theories with students at Berkeley. But now, the U.S. was at war, and in June 1942 the Manhattan Project was founded. The scientific efforts were transferred to the military, and Oppenheimer was chosen to head the project. This was an odd choice for many people. Oppenheimer didn't have a Nobel Prize, didn't have any background in the military, and was seen as a theoretical genius without practical applications. But the new leader of the military division, Brigadier General Leslie Groves, was steadfast in his choice, defending Oppenheimer against concerns that he was a political liability. And this would bring Oppenheimer back to his second home. While the Manhattan Project was still in its early stages, everyone knew their final goal was to set off an atomic bomb. This would require a safe location, far away from any nearby cities, and that called Oppenheimer to New Mexico. They took over the site of a private school near Santa Fe, and the Los Alamos Ranch School became the Los Alamos Laboratory. While this was a very isolated location with poor water supply and few road connections, the government went to work building the infrastructure required for the base. With the military taking charge, the scientists involved were expected to be commissioned into the military. There was just one problem. J. Robert Oppenheimer was not military material. The problem wasn't that he would likely argue constantly with his commanding officer, it was that he was underweight and had a chronic cough due to past bouts of tuberculosis. This, along with several other scientists objecting to being commissioned, led to a compromise where Los Alamos would be operated by the University of California under the supervision of the War Department, and the project soon grew by leaps and bounds, with several thousand people being involved in development over the years. And they weren't all just from the United States either. Many German scientists who defected joined the project, and they brought with them intelligence from Nazi Germany. Hitler was known for his grandiose plans and was just as ambitious when it came to weapons as the Americans. It was well known that he wanted a nuclear bomb of his own, but no one knew how far along the Nazi efforts were. It was only after the war that it was found that they were nowhere near the Americans, but this caused a great sense of urgency in the Manhattan Project, and some additional projects were proposed. A plan to poison German food supplies with radioactive material was rejected, not because of ethical reasons, but because the scientists believed that it couldn't be done on a large enough scale. And a plutonium-powered gun nicknamed Thin Man was developed, but ultimately trashed because reactor-produced plutonium was found to have too high a concentration for use in a gun, which meant that there was only one project left to focus on. Oppenheimer shifted his focus to an implosion-type weapon that would compress the explosive material and be delivered via a simple device. This was the bomb that would become Little Boy, the very first nuclear bomb ever dropped in combat. But first, they needed to make sure it worked. The final design was delivered on February 28, 1945. As it became clear the government would actually achieve their goal, commissions were formed to determine whether it would eventually be used in combat and how it would be handled after the war. But first, they needed to make sure it worked. It was July 16, 1945, and years of hard work were about to come to a close. The scientists had completed the first nuclear bomb prototype, and it would be detonated deep in the New Mexico desert. The site was nicknamed Trinity, and Oppenheimer was one of the many scientists present to see their experiments come to fruition, or result in shocking failure. Oppenheimer was accompanied at the test by not just military officials, but his brother, Frank, now an acclaimed scientist in his own right. No one knew what would happen when the bomb went off. Maybe the device would be a dud, or maybe it would be all too successful, creating a devastating explosion that would not be contained. But Oppenheimer no doubt was confident. He had never seen a puzzle he couldn't crack. But even he wasn't prepared for what he was about to see. As the last seconds ticked by and the announcer shouted, "Now!" the bomb went off and there was a massive burst of light. This was followed seconds later by a deep roar as the sound of the explosion hit them. Oppenheimer reportedly relaxed, the fear of failure leaving him. According to Frank, his first words after were, "I guess it worked." A suitably practical response for a man of science. But in the years to come, Oppenheimer would admit very different words came to mind. The Bhagavad Gita phrase, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," flowed into his mind as the enormity of the moment came over him. The deadliest weapon in human history had just been tested, and he was its creator. But now it was out of his hands. Oppenheimer had little regrets at first about his role in designing the bomb and hoped it would help to eliminate the despicable Hitler. There was just one problem: the war in Europe was over. Nazi Germany had been defeated through the efforts of the Allies and the Soviet Union, and Germany was currently under military occupation. But the war with Japan was still raging on, and the United States was eager to test their new weapon in combat. As Japan had still not surrendered and plans were underway to mount a ground invasion, it was determined to instead drop the first bomb, Little Boy, on the infrastructure-heavy city of Hiroshima. It devastated the city and killed over 100,000 people. But the US wasn't finished yet. It was only days later when a second, larger bomb was dropped over Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered soon after. But while the nuclear scientists were happy to see the US triumph, many were horrified by this, seeing the second bombing as unnecessary overkill. Oppenheimer in particular was haunted by his role in the Manhattan Project, even as the war ended and the boys came marching home. It was a few months later when he was granted a meeting with President Truman and expressed the opinion that he felt like he had blood on his hands. Truman did not respond well, seeing it as an insult against the president's call to drop the bomb. He kicked Oppenheimer out of the White House, but still awarded him a Medal for Merit the following year. And now a new era would begin for J. Robert Oppenheimer. The Manhattan Project was highly classified throughout the war, but the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki made it all very clear. The government declassified many of the details in the year after the war, including the identity of the man who made it possible. And then suddenly Oppenheimer was the one thing he never expected to be: a celebrity. He appeared on magazine covers and found just about everyone seeking his opinion. The problem was the government might not always like his opinion. He started advocating for international control of nuclear arms. To prevent an arms race, he wanted more power to go to the newly formed United Nations. And so J. Robert Oppenheimer's time with the government would come to an awkward end. He returned to teaching, but found he couldn't go back to his old habits. Instead, he took up a position as the head of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, an ambitious institution that played host to some of the greatest minds of the era, including Albert Einstein. He finally had a setting that could challenge him again, and it didn't hurt that it came with accommodations, including a 17th century mansion that came with servants and allowed him to indulge in his parents' passion for collecting artwork. Now that the war was over, Oppenheimer was able to return to theoretical work, his true passion. But it wouldn't last long, and the government came calling again. In the year after the war, the US wanted to avoid an arms race and to keep the US monopoly over nuclear power. Oppenheimer was appointed to a commission to determine global standards for nuclear power, and a plan was developed to oversee enforcement, including requiring inspections of other countries' resources. This was rejected by the Soviets, and the arms race was on. Oppenheimer would soon be appointed as head of the new Atomic Energy Commission, helping to determine policy and ensure safety standards. But it soon became clear he was out of step with the government, recommending restraint as the government plowed toward a full-on arms race. The Soviets tested their first atomic bomb in 1949, and it would be all downhill from there. The government wanted more and stronger nuclear weapons, including the first hydrogen bomb. This thermonuclear weapon would dwarf the previous bombs in power, and Oppenheimer strongly recommended against proceeding with it. Not only were the human casualties horrifying to him, but he knew this would cause an arms race that would potentially endanger the survival of the human race. Oppenheimer convinced the commission to reject the plans, and then they were overruled by Truman. He would stay involved, but it was clear Oppenheimer was no longer in charge of the US nuclear program. With his battle to stop the arms race lost, Oppenheimer shifted his focus to minimizing the impact. He wrote reports on the dangers of nuclear fallout and helped to develop plans for the first nuclear alert system and air defense program. He worked with the State Department on global disarmament, attempting to prevent thermonuclear testing. But it was clear the military was calling the shots now, and the Cold War with the Soviet Union was in full swing. And as the Cold War ramped up, so did suspicion. Oppenheimer was still highly influential and was having a major impact in terms of making people aware of the dangers of the weapons he had helped create. That gained him a lot of enemies, not just in the military, but in other branches of the government. They included J. Edgar Hoover, the ambitious head of the FBI, who'd been trailing Oppenheimer and investigating his ties to communists since before the war. Hoover was convinced Oppenheimer was a covert member of the party, and clearly the fact that Oppenheimer didn't want America to have the biggest and deadliest bombs possible meant that he was in league with the Soviets, and now Oppenheimer's moment of truth had arrived. Few things were more feared in the early days of the Cold War than a summons from the House Un-American Activities Committee. And in June 1949, it was Oppenheimer's turn. He was questioned by the House Committee about his links to the Communist Party USA, including the fact that many of his mentors and students had affiliations to the party. He maintained that he never belonged to the party, but his brother Frank admitted he was affiliated. And that led to him losing his job at the University of Minnesota and being thrown out of the physics community. But J. Robert Oppenheimer had escaped mostly unscathed. For now. If there was one thing J. Edgar Hoover hated, it was losing a match with a target. He would wait several more years, but in November 1953, Hoover received a letter claiming that Oppenheimer was not only a communist, but an agent of the Soviet Union. Things moved quickly after that, as Oppenheimer's security clearance was suspended and he was told to resign. Oppenheimer refused, demanding a formal hearing instead. A secret hearing held in 1954 saw no actual proof of Oppenheimer not being loyal to the US, but many officials reported on his anti-nuclear opinions and odd behavior, and in the end, the government got what they wanted. While Oppenheimer was never prosecuted, he was essentially done in government work. Oppenheimer testified freely about his affiliation with party members, to the point where it bordered on naming names, but it wasn't enough to save his role in the government. Most historians believe that he at least had sympathies for the communists but never acted on them beyond affiliations with American leftists. In the years after losing his government credentials, Oppenheimer seemed to slip into retirement, spending time in the U.S. Virgin Islands. But eventually he would return to advocacy, campaigning against dangerous science, but he kept a low profile in the anti-nuclear movement. But his last act was coming sooner than anyone knew. Oppenheimer was eventually welcomed back in some form by the government, being given an award by John F. Kennedy. But only a few years later he would be diagnosed with throat cancer. After 2 years of treatment, he passed away in February 1967 at the age of 62. His wife would follow him only 5 years later. And few men left a more complicated legacy. During the latter days of his life, Oppenheimer was rejected by many as a communist sympathizer. Today, anti-war activists often reject him as the man who unleashed the nuclear demon. His loyalties were complicated, but there is no evidence he ever aligned with the enemies of the United States or compromised its secrecy. He created the nuclear bomb and was then horrified by it. Today, Oppenheimer might be best understood as a man who would not rest until his questions were answered, only to see that some genies can't be put back in the bottle. For more on Oppenheimer's legacy, check out 50 Facts About Nuclear Weapons You Didn't Know, or watch U.S. plans for a nuclear attack for the Cold War worst-case scenario.